Well, good morning. How about this? I can stand a little closer to you. Well, it's good to be here. I come with a pretty simple message, and the simple message is this: that there is more joy to be found in owning less than we can ever find constantly pursuing more. This is a message that deep down I think we already know to be true. The problem is we live in a world that tells us the exact opposite message. Statistically speaking, we see 5,000 advertisements every single day. 1 million by the time we reach the age of 21. And every single advertisement at its core tells us that we're not as happy as we could be unless we buy whatever they're selling. Our life isn't as happy as it could be. Our life isn't as convenient or comfortable or luxurious or fulfilling. Our life will improve if we buy this one thing. And by the way, there's pretty fascinating statistics done on happiness levels in society and the amount of advertising that is being spent in a society, that the more advertising we see, the less happy we are. Do you want me to do something? Am I... Got it. I'm sorry. It's okay. Is this better? I think it was in my pocket. That's good. All right. Beautiful. It was bugging me more than it was bugging you. So sorry about that, Jordan. That's all on me. 1 million by the time we reach the age of 21. And I think what happens is we hear this message so many times we subtly begin to believe it. And suddenly we start spending lives where we are constantly pursuing bigger houses and nicer cars and trendier fashion and more toys and newer technology. And without even realizing it, we start spending our lives pursuing and accumulating more and more and more stuff. But all the while, we know that it doesn't make us happy. We know possessions aren't making us happy. And so I think maybe when someone comes along and reminds us again that there's more joy to be found in owning less than we can ever find pursuing more, it tends to ring true in our heart and resonate in our soul. And so maybe this morning is just about reminding you of something that you already know to be true, but let's take 3 hours to do it. How about that? Here's my plan. I want to start this morning by sharing my story, talking a little bit about minimalism, specifically what it is and how people are living it out. We'll talk about it, make some spiritual connections between it, take a short break, and then a few deeper topics, some other relevant topics along with that. We'll talk about that, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end, plenty of time for questions and answers, and we can get a little more into specific. How do we do this? You can ask me anything you want about how we begin implementing this in our lives, or anything that I've seen in my life. It'll be good. I'm really looking forward to it. Well, they say that the greatest seed of change in our lives is discontent. And for most of my life, I've had two streams of discontent that have been flowing through my life. Number one, I've always been a little discontented with my finances. Anyone else? Anyone else? All right, good. I am not alone. I think the numbers are something like 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck to paycheck. And I was one of them. We were one of them. Despite 4 pretty significant pay increases in my married life, we were never able to get ahead financially. And it always seemed like we should have been able to get ahead financially, but it just, as more money came in, more money must have been going out. I don't know where it was going, but we just could never seem to get ahead financially. Not living in a ton of debt, but I always say I was like one blown water heater away from having to go into debt. And so I was always a little discontented with that. I was also a little discontented concerning finances, not just how much money it cost to live my life, but who I was spending my money on. And by that, I mean, I grew up in the church. I was a pastor for 15 years. I knew full well what God had to say about being generous and taking care of the poor and meeting people's needs. And I wanted to be that. I wanted to be more, it just seemed like everything I was reading, what God was telling me to do, seemed like more than giving 10% on Sunday mornings. And yet for some reason, I couldn't ever seem to find the space to be that person that I thought God wanted me to be. And so not only was I discontent about how much money I was spending, but who I was spending it on as well. The second stream of discontent that was flowing through my life, I have begun to articulate this way. I was growing discontent over the focus of my life's energy, which I don't think I ever would have been able to articulate had it not been 12 years ago. I was living in Vermont. It was this holiday weekend, and my wife and I woke up on Saturday morning to do our spring cleaning. Okay, this is what Americans do on Saturdays, right? We run our errands, we clean the house, we do our shopping. So we're in Vermont, which has like this 9-month-long winter, and then this really short spring and summer, and then this gorgeous fall that everyone comes to town for. But we'd had this long winter. It was Memorial Day weekend. It was going to be this beautiful, sunny 3-day holiday weekend. And so my wife and I decided we would do our spring cleaning on Saturday. Sunday, I would work at the church. And then Monday, we would finally get to be able to enjoy this holiday with my family. So I get up Saturday. I offer to clean out the garage. It sounded like a manly project. It was going to be a nice sunny day. My son was 5 years old, and I had this vision of me and him bonding while we cleaned out the garage together as a family. So I wake up Salem super early for breakfast. I go down. We make this nice bacon and eggs. I'm really trying to butter them up a little bit. We have this nice breakfast, and then we got this exciting job today. We're going to clean out the garage. We go out to the garage. Everything's dirty and dusty and muddy and disorganized from the long, cold winter. And I said, okay, Salem, I think our best plan is let's pull everything out into the driveway. We'll hose everything down, and then we'll return everything in this nice, organized fashion. If you've ever lived in a winter, you know the drill. So I said, Salem, can you go grab that blue plastic bin? It looked like something that he could carry. I'm like, go grab that and just pull it out into the driveway, and then we'll just keep doing this. Well, it ends up being my big mistake of the morning because in this bin was all of his summer toys. His wiffle ball and his wiffle ball bat and football and frisbee and plastic golf clubs and everything you need to raise a child in America, apparently. But he sees all of his summer toys, and the last thing he wants to do, obviously, is help me anymore cleaning the garage. So he grabs his ball, he grabs his bat, comes up to me, he says, can I go in the backyard and play with these? I'm like, oh man, I thought we were going to do this project together. I'm like, yes, you could go play and I'll finish the garage. So he goes to run off to the backyard. Just before he does, he turns, just before he rounds the corner, he turns back and he's like, are you going to come play catch with me? And I said, no. Or I'm not going to come play catch with you. I'm cleaning the garage. Remember, this is what we do. I said, you go play. As soon as I'm done, we'll be able to play catch. So he runs off to the backyard. I start working on the garage. I don't know if you've had any of these projects. One thing leads to another. Hours later, I'm still working on the same garage. Salem's running up about every 20, 30 minutes to see if I'm done, where I'm at, and I just keep pushing him off. One more minute. I'm almost done. One more thing. I'm almost done. Just let me finish this one more thing. So as this is taking place, my next door neighbor, her name is June. She's in her 80s, and she's doing all of her yard work this entire time, which has now become a bucket list item for me that my wife will do the yard work into her 80s. That would be amazing. But anyway, so June she's pulling weeds and trimming the hedges and just after the winter, getting her house ready for the spring and summer. And I think she's noticing the frustration on my shoulders and what's happening on my side of the hedge. And so at one point, we happen to walk past each other on the property line. She's been working all morning. I've been working all morning. And she says very sarcastically, she says, "The joys of home ownership, huh?" And I said, "Well, you know what they say, the more stuff you own, the more your stuff owns you." Which I don't know, I'd read on a cat poster somewhere or something and never really considered what it actually meant. But she responds with this absolutely life-changing sentence. She says to me, "Yeah, you know, that's why my daughter is a minimalist. She keeps telling me I don't need to own all this stuff." And I stood speechless for a moment, as if this was the first time in the world somebody had told me that I didn't have to try to own everything. But I remember looking over, and in my driveway, there's this pile of dirty, dusty things I didn't really care all that much about. I've looked at my pile of things, and like all of us, I would have said my things aren't making me happy. I'm not looking for happiness in my possessions. I would have said all the things. But out of the corner of my eye, I see my 5-year-old son swinging alone on the swing set in the backyard, where he'd been all morning long. And suddenly I realized, not only was everything I owned not making me happy, even worse than that, everything I owned was actually taking me away from the very thing that did bring me happiness in life. And not just happiness, but joy and meaning and significance and fulfillment. It's one thing to say we're not looking for happiness in our possessions. It is something very different the moment we realize that they might actually be taking us away from happiness. They might be distracting us from the life we wish we were living instead. I thanked June for the conversation. It was pretty short. Ran inside and found my wife. She was inside cleaning one of the bathrooms, I think. My 2-year-old daughter was pulling at her pant leg, I assume, all morning long. And I said, "Kim, you'll never guess what June just said. She said we don't have to own this stuff anymore." And Kim's like, "You know what? That sounds pretty good right about now." And I said, "I know. Doesn't it sound amazing?" And so I ran to the computer and I typed in what is minimalism, and up pops minimalist art and minimalist music and minimalist architecture. And I'm like, everyone's trying to do things using the least amount of resources. I'm like, no, that's not exactly what I'm looking for. So I said, what is a minimalist lifestyle? And up pops this whole world of people all around the globe who have decided that they are going to own only the things they need to own. What a novel idea that we would own just the stuff we need to own in order to live our lives. Who does this? What a crazy thought that we would just have the stuff that we actually need. And I'm reading about them, and it's very interesting because they're all doing it a little bit different. They're all singing the praises of it and why they're doing it and what's happened because of their decision, but they're all doing it a little bit differently. And so there's a guy in his 20s, and he lives everything he owns fits in a couple bags, and he moves to a new country every 4 months. And the readers of his website voted as to which country he would move to next. And so he's lived everywhere you would want to send a stranger on the internet. But he's talking about minimalism and how everything fits in bags, and he's able to get up and move. And I'm like, I get it. I can see it. If everything you own fit in a couple bags, it would be very easy to move to a new country every couple months. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, but I kind of like my country. Not only that, I I like my neighborhood. I like my community. I like the school that my kids go to. I'm pastoring at a church. In order for me to do that well, I can't be moving to new countries every 3 or 4 months. And so I'm like, I can see how that would work for you, but that's not exactly what I'm looking for. I read about a guy in San Diego named Dave Bruno. He took on what he called the 100 Thing Challenge, where he was a professor at a university, and his goal was to get down to just 100 things. And so literally he took out a spreadsheet and he numbered it 1 to 100, and he listed out every single item that he owned and got the list down to 100. Literally like one purple t-shirt, one surfboard. He had his priorities in San Diego. 100. And he's talking about how much he learned through this process and how it's challenged him and really changed the way he's viewed the world and himself. I'm like, I get it. I can see how all that would happen, but man, I hate spreadsheets. And I'm thinking, I want to own less stuff, but I don't want a list of every single thing that I own somewhere. That sounds more burdensome than cleaning out my garage. I read about another couple, Logan and Tammy Strobel. They lived in Portland. They had a ton of debt, ton of credit card debt and student debt and everything. And so they were just tired of it and they needed to make the change. And so they sold their home. They moved into 200 square foot tiny home. And they just owned 100 things between them. So 2 cups and 2 plates and 2 forks and 1 cat. And as you can about imagine, they got out of debt in no time. And they're talking about how great it is, how freeing it is to finally not have this burden on their shoulders. And they're able to get up and go and do things and go other places and live their life free of debt. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking to myself, I can see it. I can see how that would certainly allow that to happen in your life. But I'm a family of 4. I probably need more than 2 plates and 2 cups and 2 forks. And I got to thinking about my life a little bit. And I started thinking about what is important to me. What do I feel God has called me to do with my life? We had 3 different small groups that were meeting in our house. I was a youth pastor at the time, and so we had a guys group, a girls group, a group of leaders meeting in our house each week. We had, I was doing a lot of premarital counseling, and so we loved having the future husband and wife over for dinner, not just to talk about the ceremony, but to talk about marriage afterwards. When new people moved into the town or began attending the church, we'd love having them over for dinner. And I started thinking about what I felt God was calling me to do with my life, and it became pretty clear that I probably need more than 4 plates and 4 cups and 4 forks. My dining room table sat 8. I thought, how about 8? How about 8 plates, 8 cups? This would allow us to keep doing. I don't need 3 or 4 sets of 8 plates. We can only use 1 set at a time. Anyway. And so I learned 2 things pretty early on. Number 1, minimalism always looks different from one person to another. And it has to look different from one person to another. We have different sized families. We're in different stages of life. We have different careers. We have different passions. We live in different places. Someone who lives in the city is going to own something different than someone who lives in the suburbs or out in a rural setting. We all have different things that are important to us. And so minimalism always looks different from person to person. But probably more important to that, the thing that I learned is this, that minimalism is essentially about values. It is essentially about what is most important to you. What do you need to own in order to live the life that you most value? And what are all the distractions that are keeping you from living the life that you actually value? And so that became our definition of minimalism. Minimalism is the intentional promotion of the things we most value by removing anything that distracts us from it. the intentional promotion of the things we most value in life by removing anything that distracts us from it. And so with that as the filter, what is it that God wants us to do with our life? What do we need to own in order to do more of that? And then what is all the excess that we've accumulated that is actually keeping us from doing more of what God wants us to do? So we began going through our home. It took us about 9 months. We got rid of about 70% of our things along the way. I'll talk more about the process in a moment, actually a little bit later today. But if I were to go back to that Saturday, I called my mom. She lives in South Dakota. I was in Vermont. They're still in South Dakota. Most of my family still lives there. And I remember calling my mom, and I'm like, Mom, you'll never guess, we've decided to become minimalist. And my mom said, I could hear her on the other side of the phone. She goes, "Oh, Joshua. I was just watching Oprah, and she was interviewing some minimalists. Did you know that they don't go to the grocery store, but they get all their food out of dumpsters?" And I thought, oh man, I didn't read that anywhere in the literature. Well, I've since come to learn that there are a group of people, and I don't know if it's a hobby or a passion or what it is, but like their hobby is to not spend any money on food. And so they do a lot of gardening, and sometimes they jump in dumpsters to find food if they need to. It's a hobby, and it's a people group, I guess, and they call themselves freegans. And there's a difference between freegans and minimalists, but I can see why Oprah might have had them on the same show, is how I've come to surmise what might have happened there. But based on that conversation, I started a blog. Actually, that was a Saturday. I started it on Monday. Becoming minimalist, that was the decision that we had made. I wanted a place to serve as a journal, a place to serve as a diary where I could write about what I was getting rid of and what I was keeping and what I was learning and what I was noticing along the way. I wanted to use it as a way to help my mom know we are still buying FDA-approved produce for her grandchildren. And so I think that first month we had 2 readers. I don't even think my wife was reading. My wife was reading at the time, but we now have over 2 million readers every single month that come to becomingminimalist.com. I get to be here today. I was in North Dakota last week. I was in Ottawa, Canada. The week before that, I've been in Poland and Sweden and Iceland and Brazil. And this is a message that is growing. It is a message that resonates with people. We have reached this level of peak stuff, I think, in our world, where we have been accumulating more and more and more, and it is not leading to higher levels of happiness or life satisfaction. And so when someone comes along with the message that there's actually more joy to be found in owning less, it tends to resonate with people. They tend to return to it. We're just so bombarded with the opposite message over and over and over again. Well, one of the reoccurring themes on the blog as I got started was every time I noticed how my life was improving because I owned less stuff, I would make a note, and I would just put a little journal, I would just put a little blog post entry. Hey, you know what I just noticed? This is getting better in my life. This is improving in my life. And I actually find that it is not a difficult question for people to answer. And so I'm going to ask you, just turn to the person next to you, wherever you are. And if you're all alone, you can do it by yourself. But here is the question. If you were to own less stuff, how would your life improve? And be as practical as you can think of. If I own less stuff, this would improve in my life. Make a quick little list. I'll give you about a minute or two to do that. Did you get a good list? I hear you silently whispering them. You don't want to give away any to me. All right, what do you, I would love to have you yell out a couple. Let's just yell out a couple. What do you got? Less cleaning? More time? You can find what you need. A girl after my own heart. Less choices? More money? Less frustration? Less maintenance? Less debt? Beautiful. Let me give you my list. I'll repeat some of them that you said. Less cleaning, obviously. I love having a clean house, but I hate cleaning, and I have found that minimalism works well for me. Of course, it's not just that we hate the cleaning, it's the time, right? All the time that goes into the cleaning where we could be doing something else and the wish that we were doing something else. And actually, when you think about it, it's not just the cleaning, but it's all the maintaining, the organizing of stuff, the managing of stuff, the replacing, the researching, the next thing we're going to buy, the recycling, the repairing. Or how about this, when you even take a step back? How much time do we spend working just so we can make more money so that we can do more shopping to buy more things that we bring home just to clean and organize and manage, maintain, repair, replace? As I began owning less and became content with owning less, I was shocked at how much time became available to me. So less cleaning, more time, more money, less money to take care of things, less money spent shopping to buy new things, and then more money means any number of different things to different people, right? More money might mean that you're able to get out of debt. It might mean that you're able to get ahead financially. It might mean that you're able to start giving more. It might mean that one of the spouses is able to cut back hours at work and spend more time at home if that's what you desire, right? Like more money. Less money going out means it could mean you could change jobs. You could pick a different job that pays less, but you find more fulfilling. So more money means a lot of different things. Less stress. Randy Elkhorn, in his book, Money, Possessions, and Eternity, says it this way: every increased possession adds increased anxiety onto our lives. And it is so true. The New York Times, a couple years back by now, ran an article where they called the modern American generation the most stressed, hurried, tired generation of all time. And I think that they're right. I tend to think that the accumulation of things in our life, I don't think we really appreciate how unique we are living our lives today. The average American home has 300,000 things inside of it, according to the LA Times. Never in human history, for all of mankind, have human beings owned as much stuff as we do today. Never before have our houses been as big, full of so much stuff. And we seem to think that we can handle it, or we seem to think that it's improving our life. But I think it's clearly not. Less distraction in life, fewer decisions that need to be made. This whole idea of decision fatigue, that the more decisions we make over the course of a day, the less wise our decisions get by the end of the day. As I own fewer things and have less things around my house, it's just fewer decisions that I need to make. Freedom from the past. Focus life more on experiences, more space in my home. The average American home has tripled in size in the last 50 years, and still 10% of Americans rent off-site storage. Maybe our houses are not too small. Maybe we're just putting too much stuff inside of them. And an even higher percentage can't park their car in the garage, by the way. Not to get too personal. As I began owning less, I became a better example for my kids. I don't know what the three most common words are in the American home, if it's I love you, or if it's I want that, or let's go shopping, or it's on sale, or let's check Amazon, right? As I began owning less and became content with less, I became a better example for my kids. That there are simply more important things to pursue in life than material possessions. And man, we get so upset when our kids want things that they don't need. Meanwhile, we've got closets that are too full and drawers that don't shut and garages that we can't park our car in. And we get upset that our kids would have the audacity to ask for something that they don't need. Meanwhile, our house is full of stuff that we don't need ourselves. Better for the environment, I'm sure you all had on your list. Minimalism allowed me to own higher quality things. That being minimalist isn't the same as being frugal. There are some people who are frugal, who are minimalist by nature, but it isn't always the same thing. Minimalism doesn't mean you own the cheapest everything that you can get. In fact, a lot of times it means something different. If you're going to own something, then you want to have a high quality thing of them. If I don't need 20 pairs of pants in my closet, I can own just several pair that are particularly slimming. I began comparing myself less with other people, at least in terms of physical possessions. I was at a friend's house one time, and he was having friends over for dinner, and he was kind of lamenting the fact that he had friends coming over for dinner. And I said, why would you be upset about friends coming over? And well, here's the story. He said, a couple weekends ago, we were out at a social function. We met this couple and we hit it off really well. And we decided right then and there that we would get together for 2 dinners, that we would have dinner at their house and they would come to our house for dinner. And so last weekend, we went to their house for dinner. And Joshua, it was the biggest, most extravagant house I think I've ever been in my entire life. And now, tonight, they're coming over to our house, and I'm just a little worried about how it's going to go. And I just thought, man, what a terrible way to live. That you would compare yourself with other people in terms of physical possessions. There is literally no joy to be found in that whatsoever. How would you ever find any happiness in comparing what you have with what someone else has? Man, I drive by big houses now, and I think to myself, who changes the light bulbs in that thing? Like, I don't even want the bigger stuff. We moved into a smaller house years ago and couldn't be more happy. More gratitude for the things that I have, less work for someone else, right? Someone's got to handle all your stuff at some point. Everyone's got to handle it at some point. Someone's got to handle it. Either you're going to do it or you're going to pass that burden on to someone else who's probably already emotional about your passing. More contentment, more generosity. Here's what I found, that as we began owning less, I had more money and more time and more focus and fewer distractions. I had more opportunity to pursue my greatest passions in life. Whatever that is for you, minimalism will free you up to pursue it. At one point, we were going through one of the bathrooms and just emptying out drawers and cabinets and throwing away things that we just didn't need. And I started a sentence to my wife. We've been doing this a little while and had seen many of these benefits start living out in our lives. And I started to turn to her and I said, man, this is so great. Where has minimalism been my entire life? How come no one told me about this before? Why did I have to be in my 30s till someone used the word minimalism? Where has this been? And it dawned on me mid-sentence that this isn't new. This isn't a new idea. In fact, Jesus was saying the exact same thing 2,000 years ago. Jesus was saying the exact same thing that I'm saying right now. That you won't find life in an abundance of possessions. But for some reason, every time I read what Jesus said about money, about possessions, about giving to the poor, it seems like every time I read Jesus saying that, I thought one of two things. Man, he's really testing my faith here. Do I really have enough faith to live this out? And that's what this is all about. Although probably the more frequent thought I had was, man, Jesus wants me to live a miserable life. Okay, I get it, Jesus. I can get all these treasures in heaven, and that would be fantastic as long as I live this barren, boring, sacrificial life today. If I do that now, I'll get all these rewards in heaven. And I really struggled with making the trade-off a reality in my life. But it all changed when I started actually doing what Jesus called us to do. And when I started actually giving away the things that I didn't need, when I actually started living with just the stuff that I actually had, that I actually needed, I discovered that he wasn't calling me to a boring life. He was calling me to a better life. He was calling me to a more abundant life, a life with more joy and meaning and purpose, significance, fulfillment, satisfaction, a better life than a life accumulating a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't matter. Go figure, right? That Jesus knew all along the best way for us to make the most of the life that we have. A couple scriptures that always come back to me, and I had heard for years, and I could never square away with my life until I started doing this. The first one comes in Luke chapter 3. It's a story of John the Baptist. John the Baptist's only job is to pave the way for the Messiah. His job is to prepare Israel for Jesus. And in Luke chapter 3, he finally breaks through with the people. He's out in the wilderness, and the people of Israel come out to find him. And they ask him the question, okay, what do we need to do? What do we do to get ready for the coming Messiah? And here's what John says. John the Baptist says this, starting in verse 10. What should we do then? The crowd asked. John answered, anyone who has 2 tunics should share with one who has none, and anyone who has food should do the same. Tax collectors came. Teacher, what should we do? Don't collect any more than you are required to collect. Soldiers came and said, what should we do? And he replied, don't extort money, don't accuse people falsely, and be content with your pay. And that is the end of the story. Picture this. This is John's big moment. This is what he's come here to do, is to prepare the people for Jesus. And they go find him in the wilderness. And they said, okay, we're in. What do we do to get ready for Jesus? And everything he said had to do with physical possessions. Get rid of your tunics. Get rid of your food. Don't collect more than you need to. Be content with what you have. I'm trying to put myself in John the Baptist's shoes, sandals. And I'm trying to think, if people came to me and said, what do we have to do to prepare our hearts for Jesus? I don't know what I would have said. Go back and read the Old Testament prophecies. Make sure you know them. Go spend time in the temple. Go spend time alone in solitude with God. But John, everything had to do with physical possessions. Why would that be the case? I'll tell you why I think that is the case. Because I learned things about myself by removing physical possessions that I don't think I ever would have learned without going through this. I took a van load of stuff to Goodwill, and it felt great. A second van load of stuff to Goodwill felt... By like the third van load of things that I was dropping off at Goodwill, I started to ask myself some pretty difficult questions, starting with, why in the world do I have 3 van loads of things in my house that I don't need? Why did I accumulate all of this stuff in the first place? Why would we buy things that we don't need? Why would we go buy things that we don't need? What is the motivation there? Man, I started searching my heart on that question, and I did not like what I found. I found a little more greed than I wanted, a little more jealousy, selfishness. Maybe I was trying to impress people with the things that I owned. Maybe I was trying to prove my value and prove my success to other people. Maybe I did focus a lot on what the external things were in my life. Maybe I was looking for security in the things that I bought. Maybe I was a little more attached to the world than I ever thought I was. Maybe I really was looking for happiness in the things that I was accumulating. And I think only when we begin to see how tightly the world has hearts are we able to free it and open it for what Christ wants to do inside of it. And I never would have learned those things or noticed those things had I not begun taking things. This is a hard process for people. And they wrestle with why do I have such a hard things? And I always say, if you're asking those questions, don't leave. Like sit in that and ask yourself, why is this hard for me to get rid of? Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? Why do I have a garage that I can't park in? Why are my closets overflowing? How come we can't seem to get ahead financially? Start learning what the motivations are in there. 2 more just quick ones to mention, and we can talk more later about the spiritual aspects here. But there's another pretty significant story about the rich young ruler in Luke chapter 18. And it's a story that I'd heard years, forever and ever, right? The rich young ruler comes to Jesus. He says, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, you got to do all these commandments. And the guy's like, well, I did them all. And Jesus is like, okay, you're missing one thing. Sell your possessions, give to the poor, come follow me, and you will have treasures in heaven. And I have heard that story taught in dozens of churches from dozens of different teachers all across my life. And it's interesting to me that almost every teacher said at one point while reading this story, they said, now I know Jesus said, sell your possessions, come follow me, and you'll have treasures in heaven. But I want you to know that Jesus didn't really mean sell your possessions, come follow me, and you'll have treasures in heaven. And they'll say, what Jesus really meant is, whatever is keeping you from following Jesus fully with your life, that's what you need to get rid of. And everybody in the room breathes a sigh of relief that they don't actually have to get rid of their possessions. I've come to see that story completely different. I think Jesus meant exactly what he meant. That Jesus meant if you are going to fully follow him, if you're going to fully live your life, fully experiencing eternal life today, you cannot do it with a pile full of excess possessions that you are carrying with you. Now, it's interesting because different people come to Jesus at different times, and he calls the disciples, and he's like, leave your boats, leave your nets, and come follow me. And they leave everything and they follow him. He heals a demon-possessed man in the book of Matthew. The man comes to Jesus while they're getting on the boat, and he's like, I'm ready to go. Where are we headed? And Jesus says, no. Go back to your city and be my witness in the place that you live. And so Jesus calls people to different things. He calls some people to give up everything. I think of like Mother Teresa, right? Like there are some people who receive that special call on their lives. But there are other people who are called to say, no, go live in your home. Be your witness for me in the job that you have, in the role that you have, in the neighborhood that you have. Does that mean that we buy the biggest house and the nicest car and fill it with as much clothing as we possibly can? No, because there are still principles here about owning just what we need to fully following him and living the life that he's called us to live. I'm going to end there for the time being. We'll take a short 10-minute break, and you're going to put a timer on the clock and everything, so you only get 10 minutes. Let's take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll be right back here. All right, well, welcome back. Wonderful. Hope you enjoyed your break and threw away a bunch of stuff. And now we're back here. I appreciate how they laid out the morning. I want to talk a little bit more, some deeper thoughts around not specifically minimalism, but some deeper thoughts around removing distractions, or as it says, removing obstacles from loving well. I want to take a little deeper dive into some related topics that I have seen emerge in my life after running down this road for a while. And then, we'll have a nice little journal exercise, and then we'll come back and do all the specific questions of how do we live this out and how do we make this happen. So I think this will work quite well. There was about a 2-month period of time. This was, I don't remember the year, but I remember the events pretty significantly well. There was a very, one of the most viral articles that I've ever seen written was written by a hospice nurse named Bronnie Ware. And she wrote an article, I think didn't seem like it was big, it didn't like start in the New York Times or anything, but she wrote an article on the top 5 regrets of the dying. She was a hospice nurse, and she would just make notes about end-of-life conversations and things that she was noticing. And so she ended up writing this op-ed about, these are the top 5 regrets that I see people having at the end of their life. And it went viral immediately. She ended up quickly writing a book about it, which was a New York Times bestseller, and all this, because this stuff fascinates people, right? Here, by the way, are the top 5 regrets of the dying, according to Bronnie Ware. Number 1, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life that others expected of me. Number 2, I wish I hadn't worked so much. Number 3, I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. Number 4, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. And number 5, I wish I had let myself be happier. I can read those later again if you need them, but that's not the point of it. People just always want to know what the top 5 regrets are. So I read this article, and it was being spread everywhere on the internet. About a month and a half later, I had this really unique conversation with my grandfather. My grandpa is 99. He's a pastor, full-time up in South Dakota. He's on radio and television all over the world. In fact, his preaching is on here in Phoenix on Sunday mornings, I think. But he was in his mid-90s, and he called me into his office one time when we happened to be back in South Dakota, which I usually stop by his office and stop in to say hi, but I've never had can we have a 1 p.m. meeting? Can you meet me in my office with my grandfather? And so it was a bit out of the ordinary, but sat down, and we started talking, and he pulled out a sheet of paper, and he slid it across the table, And it was his funeral service, planned out to the minute. Scripture, song, message, who was doing what. And my name was on the list. And so he said, I want you to be a part of my funeral, and here's where you'll be, and I want you to read this and say a few things. And it was a very memorable moment in my life. Not so much that my grandpa would have planned out his funeral, because that's the type of guy that he is. But when he was telling me about it, and when I looked into his eyes, I saw a man who was not afraid to die. He would talk about going to see his wife. He would talk about getting to meet Jesus. He would talk about the life that he had lived and how now in his mid-90s, as the end was coming, it was a man who, I'm sure he made mistakes and there are some things he wished that he would do differently, but it was a man who had few regrets about the life that he had chosen to live. And I had just read the article about the top 5 regrets, that people get to the end of their life and they regret how they spent it and they regret how they wasted. And to see an example in front of me of a man who did not regret and was satisfied and fulfilled with the life that he had lived in. And I started to ask myself the question. Of course, I'm talking about minimalism. I'm talking about the distractions that keep us from meaning and keep us from fulfillment and keep us from significance. And I'm starting to wrestle with this question of what is it that leads people to get to their end of the life, and some people regret how they spent it, and some people satisfied with how they spent it. And certainly there's the spiritual piece and the relationship with Christ and no fear of death, and certainly that is one big element of it. But I don't always get to have that conversation when I speak on this topic in different places, so I'm glad I get to say it here. But I started wrestling with what are the distractions in life? What are the ways that people waste their life that at the end they begin to look back with regret? Seneca, the Roman philosopher, he says it this way so well. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. When life is wasted in needless luxury and is spent on no good activity, we are forced at last by death's final constraint to realize that it has passed away before we knew it was passing. Life is long if you know how to use it. We, of course, know that we find our joy, we find our meaning, we find our significance, we find our satisfaction in living the life that God has called us to live, in loving well, in fulfilling the work that he has called us to do in his kingdom, and that when we live our lives focused on him, that this is when we get to the end of our life and can take pride in it. But along the way, I've started to think, what are the distractions that trip up people from that? What are the obstacles? What are the distractions that keep us from living well and keep us from loving well? So let me get a little bit deep here for the next 20 minutes. The first distraction that I see that keep people from living well and keep people from loving well are possessions and property, the pursuit of possessions and property. That's what this morning was about, that the more possessions we collect, the more we are distracted from living well, from loving well, the more the pursuit of them becomes our passion and becomes where we spend our time and our focus, the less we have left over for the things that matter most. Ernest Becker was a philosopher in the 60s or 70s. And he makes this fascinating connection between death and possessions. And I've always thought it was pretty sharp. He says this: of all the things that move man, one of the principles is his terror of death. Of all the principles that move man, the most major is his terror of death. What man fears is not his extinction, but insignificance. We all want to know that our life counted for something. And then he went on to say, and he said, through accumulated possessions and property, money gives power now, and through accumulated property, power, it gives us power in the future as well. And so he says, what motivates a lot of people to pursue possessions and property and things is this knowing that we are going to die at some point. And the best way, people think, for them to outlive themselves is to have accumulated as much stuff as they can, that they can outlive themselves in that way. And so this becomes a major pursuit for people. We, of course, know, or at least we realize, that there are far better and far more important ways to outlive our lives than passing property down from one person to another and to another. I was thinking one day, as a matter of fact, about what I most want to be known for at the end of my life. Someone told me one time that I shouldn't focus on legacy and I shouldn't focus on how I'm going to be remembered at the end of my life. And I just responded, look, we're all going to be remembered for something. Like, our lives are going to be remembered by the people closest to us. And either we're going to be remembered for the bad things, that we're going to be remembered for things we don't want to be remembered for, or we're going to be remembered for things that we do want to be remembered for. And so how do we capitalize on the things that we want to be remembered for? And as I think of what do I want to be most remembered for, I'm a little intrigued at what we get embarrassed for these days. Like, we tend to be embarrassed if, it's very interesting. If you live in your life in this bubble among your friends, you don't feel very embarrassed. But the first time you have to wear your clothes to like this high society event where everyone's got incredibly nice clothes, or you're fine with your car until you have to drive to the really ritzy, until you're driving down LA and there's all these fancy cars and suddenly your car doesn't look quite so good anymore. The clothes you're wearing don't look quite so good anymore in this particular gathering, right? Like, we tend to get embarrassed about some of those things, or I think we should be a bit more embarrassed that our closets are full and we can't park in our garages. I think we should get embarrassed at how much money we spend on our stuff rather than giving it away to other people. I've gotten to the point where I would be embarrassed to drive a luxury car. I mean, I don't know what AMV cars drive, but forget the guy's name. He said, if you can afford to buy a luxury car, you can do more good in the world by buying a reliable one. And I have come to see that to be true, to believe that to be true, that I would almost see it as wasteful to spend this much money on myself when there's that much need out there in the world. But as we begin pursuing things, we compare our lives with other people, and maybe this psychology of wanting to outlive ourselves, we get distracted by possessions and property. And at the end of our life, we look back and we can see how much was wasted on things that don't matter. A second distraction, moving beyond that topic, is the pursuit of money. The pursuit of money and the pursuit of wealth.
keeps us from a life that is well lived and a life of loving well when we pursue money constantly. Here's a pretty fascinating statistic. 72% of Americans are stressed about money. 72% of Americans have financial related stress, which probably doesn't surprise us. But when I hear that stat, I am amazed when I consider the fact that we are one of the wealthiest nations in the history of the world. Like we are one of the wealthiest nations in the history of the world, and still 72% of us are worried about money. Why would that be the case? It's not that there isn't enough money. We have clothes, we have food, we have shelter. Like we have all of these things. Why are we getting stressed about money? I think people are getting stressed about money. We are getting stressed about money because we keep looking for money to provide something that it was never designed to provide. We look for money to provide happiness, and we look for money to provide security. And we think to ourselves, if I had a little more money, I wouldn't be worried about money. If I had a little bit more money, if I was making a little bit more money, my life would be better. I would be a happier person. And so here's what happens. We're living our life and we have this certain level of happiness, this certain level of security. And we think to ourselves, if I had this much money, I wouldn't worry about money anymore, right? There's probably a number. If I had this much money, I would never have to worry about money again. And we work really hard, and we make all these sacrifices, and we cut corners, and we're like, I'm just going to spend a few more evenings at the office. I'm going to hustle. And we get to this level of money, and we discover that we're not actually that much happier, and we don't actually feel that much more secure. We have just as much stress about money as we had when we were back there. And so rather than taking a step back and thinking, maybe I'm looking for security in the wrong places, what do? We just move the goalpost. And we think to ourselves, oh, I just had the wrong number. Actually, it's this much money, then I'll feel secure. Then I'll have true happiness. And so we cut some more corners and we hustle. So now we're hustling through our 40s, right, to get more and more and more. And we get to this point and we realize that we're not that much happier and we still have financial insecurity. Did you know that 55% of millionaires would not describe themselves as wealthy? And when asked, people who had $10 million net worth, when the question was asked, how much money do you need to feel secure financially? $10 million net worth. 40% of them responded by saying just 25% more. It never ends. If we're looking for happiness and security in money, we spend our whole lives chasing it. And we get to the end and we think to ourselves, what did it get me at the end? And this doesn't even begin to account for all that Jesus had to say about wealth. Do you know how many times Jesus warned wealthy people? Like probably more than anyone, maybe the Pharisees a little bit more. But other than that, he constantly went back to, be careful if you're wealthy. Here are the dangers of wealth. Because wealth, there's this very popular thinking, and I disagree with it. And the thinking is this, that wealth doesn't change a person. Wealth just reveals who you are. And people say it over and over and over again. And I don't think it's true. As a matter of fact, I know it's not true. I know wealth changes a person. And that's why Jesus went over and over, and Paul over and over again, be careful, warn those who are wealthy. If you are wealthy, be careful about this thing and that thing. It doesn't mean that you can't be a godly, wealthy person. It just means that there are very unique temptations that come with wealth that most of us don't think about and most of us don't realize. And so we can think of the temptations of poverty, right? Greed and selfishness, and if you're really desperate, stealing, right? Like you can picture what the temptations are with poverty. But very few people take a step back and say, but what are the temptations now present in my life because I have means? Things like isolation, things like pride and arrogance, and lack of empathy, self-dependence. I've come to realize that maybe the greatest danger of wealth is the assumption that we don't actually have it. And so when we read the Bible, and James is making commands and warnings against those of you who are wealthy, every time we read that sentence, we think of the other guy, right? Yeah, so-and-so needs to be careful of this and that. And we don't even realize that we're the ones, like we're the wealthy ones. If you make more than $35,000 a year, you are the top 1% worldwide. If you make more than $34,000, you are the 1%. There's so much railing against the 1%. That's you. If you make more than $40,000 worldwide, we don't see it because we compare ourselves in America to people who have a lot more. But Jesus was very clear that this is something that we need to be on guard against. In 1 Timothy, Paul says, those who desire to be rich fall into a temptation and a trap that leads men into destruction and despair. Those who desire to be rich fall into a temptation and a trap that leads men into destruction and despair. And yet, I bet if you go into any church and you ask the question, how many of you want to be rich? What, 90% of hands go up? Sure, I'd want to be rich. I'll take it. Not even realizing the traps and the temptations that come along with it. So becoming minimalist grew pretty slow, and then it grew pretty big. And so I was writing about minimalism and owning less. At some point, I had a literary agent, and we started getting some feelers for writing a book. And there was this moment where 4 or 5 years ago, I had 9 different publishers asking me to write a book for them about owning less. And I asked my agent, I said, well, what do we do now? And he said, well, now we just bid them against each other and we see who's going to pay you the most for the book. And it became pretty clear pretty early on that I was going to get paid a lot of money to write a book about how owning a lot of stuff will distract you from the life you want to live. And I remember sitting down on the couch with Kim, and I said, "What are we going to do? We're going to be faced pretty early on with the question: do I really believe everything I'm writing? Because if we want a bigger house, bigger street, we could go get it. Do I really believe everything that I'm writing?" And of course, I believe everything that I'm writing to be true. And so we decided that we would take the money from the books. I didn't need it. I wasn't spending a lot of money to live my life. And so we took the money and we started a nonprofit organization called The Hope Effect. Through a series of conversations, the Hope Effect is changing how the world cares for orphans. There is actually decades worth of research that orphanages are pretty harmful for children. That the institutional orphanage, Little Orphan Annie, right, a whole bunch of kids, a few adults kind of coming in and coming out, that it's really harmful for children. 70 to 80% of kids that grow up in orphanages end up incarcerated, in prostitution, or homeless. Because brains don't develop correctly in that type of an environment. The classic example is the first time you bring your baby home, and the first time the baby smiles, it's like the biggest thing in the world. You're calling for the husband to come in, you're calling for the other kids, and you're doing everything you can to get the baby to smile again. And then the baby smiles, and you all cheer, and you take pictures, right? And like the baby learns pretty early on that this is how I interact with people. But if you're a child in a crib in a large institution and you smile and no one responds, and then you smile again and no one responds, the brain just doesn't make the connection that this is how I interact with other people. And then you multiply it beyond what crying means and what talking means, and walking or pulling the person's hair next to me and no one says anything. And you can just see. So we started the Hope Effect. There's information out there on the table, and I'm happy to talk more about it because we just got approved in Sonora, Mexico. They just changed their law to allow foster care for the first time in their state. That's the state just south of us, and we're taking the lead in finding foster families for orphan children in Hermosillo. We're in Honduras, doing a number of different things. But that's my little pitch for the Hope Effect, and it's really important work that we're doing. But if I were to go back to that conversation with my wife about what we were going to do with the finances, I had a conversation with my sister. I was in my backyard, and we were talking about what we were doing and the Hope Effect and starting it. And I got a lot of different advice about here's what you should do with the money and here's what you should do. And I asked my sister, I said, so we're going to start this nonprofit. What would you have done? And she said, well, I probably would have started a college fund for my kids. And I thought, that's actually a pretty good idea. Can't believe that never crossed my mind that I would start a college fund for my kids. But I responded to her and I said, yeah, but Jana, do you think if I took this money and I used it to care for orphans around the world, that if I used my excess to care for orphans and to get orphan children into families where they have a future, do you really think that when my kids reach college age, that God's not going to provide a way for them to go to college? Like, that's just not the God that I believe in. If I do what God has called me to do with my money and my life and my finances, then certainly there's a way for him to provide for them to go to college when the time comes. And what I learned in that one sentence, in that one conversation is this, that I have never felt more secure in my finances. I've never felt more secure in my money than when I started giving it to the things that I knew God wanted me to give it to. When I was just collecting and when I was thinking that there was a zero, one more zero, and I would feel secure with my money, I never found it. But as soon as I started giving what I had to God, I knew that he was going to provide for me. I think we read these things about God taking care of our needs and God clothing us and God taking care of us. And there's always this little, like in the back of our head, yeah, but is he really going to do it? Is he really going to do it? And I think part of that comes from the fact that we know we're not actually as faithful with our money as we should be. And so we're like, yeah, but man, I'm holding on to a lot of money. Like I'm keeping a lot of my stuff. I'm actually kind of selfish and kind of greedy with all my things. Is God really going to take care of me after I've been living a life this way? But when we give it and when we remove that distraction, we're able to live well. We're able to start loving people better, sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small ways. But when we can overcome the desire for wealth is when we can start practically loving incredibly well. I'm run out of time, but two more that I want to mention. The third one, possessions, money, these are the distractions that keep us from loving well. The third one is accolades. And how am I going to do this short? I have found in my own life that the pursuit of possessions, the pursuit of money, things that I'm not entirely over them, but I work pretty hard to overcome them. But the pursuit of accolades and the pursuit of praise is probably the one that continues to get me more and more and more. That when we live our life searching for the praise and accolades of others, that we can't possibly become all that God wants us to be. So January 2015 was this really amazing, I'll tell this short story. January 2015 was this pretty incredible month for me. I self-published a book called Clutter Free with Kids, which was the #1 parenting book on Amazon for 2 weeks. And I self-published it myself. Like, it was just me putting it up on Amazon. And it was #1. It was the first month we had over 1 million page views on Becoming Minimalist. And we just passed 100,000 fans in the Facebook group. And like, all these amazing things were happening in this 1 month. About 4 days later, I was at my computer, and all this buzz happened that there was another blogger in the minimalist movement who was featured on yahoo.com. Like, people were still using yahoo.com. And they became instantly famous. Like, it was not just, it was the New York Times, it was the Today Show, it was CNBC. Like, immediately their story of finding minimalism was broadcast all over the country. And I was sitting in my chair, and I was so jealous and envious. I had just had one of the most exciting months of my life, and yet all I could think of, man, that should be me. That should be me. This should be my story. I tell my story better than that story is told. Like, it should be me. I sat in this for weeks of just jealousy and envy. Went to a writers' conference in San Diego about 2 or 3 weeks later. Anne Lamott was on stage, and someone had asked a question about getting their work out and not enough people reading it, and or maybe it was they had written something and they were getting some criticism from it. How do you deal with negative reviews? It was like that type of question for Anne Lamott. She's this incredible speaker, writer, and she responded with this sentence that hit me right square in the eyes. She said, "If you are looking for your fulfillment in life in other people's opinions of you, you are never going to find it. If you are looking for fulfillment in life in other people's opinions of you, you are never going to find it." And it was exactly where I was. And this looks different. Sometimes I'm trying to impress a boss. I'm trying to impress a sibling. I'm trying to impress a parent who always gave more attention to your twin brother who excelled in athletics. Whatever it might be. But right? Like, if your whole life is about trying to please somebody, or if your whole life is trying to please a certain number of people that they would know you, when that becomes the driving factor, we start living our life differently than if we were living a life where we were just trying to love people well. Because sometimes loving people well doesn't look like receiving accolades and praise from other people. There's a lady in my church in Vermont. She had 2 daughters. She was a pediatric nurse. There was a child born with special needs, and the mom left the child at the hospital. The pediatric nurse went home and told her husband, an elder at the church. They started praying about this, and it didn't take long because they didn't have a lot of time, but they decided that they would adopt this special needs baby, newborn, from the hospital. knowing what it was, being a big response. This is an entire lifetime commitment you're taking to care for this human being. And so they brought the baby home, and 6 months later, the husband died, tragically. And so here was this now single mother with 2 daughters and 1 newborn that required all of her time and all of her attention and all of her effort. And I can tell you, if you were to meet Cindy, there is nothing about her that would impress you in how she looks. She looks pretty tired. She looks pretty ragged. She looks pretty worn down, as you can imagine, caring for a child constantly for the last 12, 13, 14 years by now. There's nothing that would impress you on the outside. But when I see Cindy, I see Jesus. Like I see someone who has lived their entire life loving other people. And so sometimes loving well doesn't look like praise and accolades. And when we begin chasing those, too often it keeps us from what matters. There's one last one. The pursuit of leisure. The pursuit of leisure, the pursuit of possessions, the pursuit of money, the pursuit of accolades. And in our society, we have become infatuated with leisure. CNN just said that the new American dream is early retirement. I read my grandpa, of course, is 99 and works full time. And so I learn a lot from him. But he'll say to me, Joshua, there's no retirement in the Bible. You don't find retirement listed in the Bible. Quite the opposite. You find God telling Abraham that you're going to work from dawn till dusk. You're going to work all the days of your life. And it's really quite, the whole idea of retirement is about 100 years old. It's not that long of a history. And I wonder if it's really contributing to our lives the way we think it would. I think what it has happened because of leisure, because of the pursuit of retirement, because of the pursuit of leisure, is that work has become the thing you do in order to get out of work. Like, work is what I do now to save enough money so I never have to work ever again in my life. And in that way, Dorothy Sayers says it this way. She says, work has become selfish. Work has become the thing that I do for the things that I can accumulate for myself. And work is what I do just for my own benefit. But work didn't start out that way, right? Work became, hey, you're really good at farming. Why don't you farm for all of us? Why don't you hunt for all of us? Why don't you sow for all of us? I'll garden. I'll build the houses, right? Everyone's doing what they're good at so that all of society benefits. In exchange for me doing my passions and my talents well, someone else does what they're good at, what they're good at, and everybody benefits from work. Paul says that work is love. That the job that you do, and this isn't just paid jobs, right? If you're a stay-at-home mom, if you're retired from full-time employment and you're volunteering over here or over there, right? But the work that we're doing is love for other people. And when we simply see work as the thing that we're trying to get out of, we miss, I think it becomes a distraction. I think when we begin desiring a life of leisure rather than a life where we are working every day for the benefit of other people. My grandpa says the best fruit grows on the most mature trees. Which is so true. And again, the best example is in the Old Testament where the priests Once they reached the age of 40, they stopped carrying the tabernacle around the desert, and the younger priests carried the tabernacle, and the older priests became the mentors to the younger ones. And so I understand life seasons and changing what you're doing, and it might look different from season to season, but as long as you're contributing somewhere, as long as you're serving somewhere, as long as you're helping other people somewhere, somehow, this is how we end up loving well with our lives and living well and have no regrets at the end. So I'll issue that as just a challenge, and we will. Yeah, happy to answer any questions about anything that I talked about today. I don't want to take too much more of your time just talking to myself, but in terms of how do we implement minimalism in our homes, or you don't even have to use the word minimalism if you don't want. How do I at least start getting rid of stuff that I don't need, even if I don't want to call myself a minimalist? Let me give you the thoughts, the steps that I'll just start here, and then we can springboard into some questions. The first thing that I have people do is I have them declare why they want to own less. So that second question on there is perfect, and it's brilliant. The goal of minimalism isn't to just own the fewest amount of things as possible. In fact, when my first book, The More of Less, Finding the Life You Want Under Everything You Own, when I was meeting with the publisher, she asked me what I want to name the book. And I said, I want to name it Becoming Minimalist. And she said, well, you can't name it that. And I said, oh, that's how this works? I said, why not? And she said, well, because becoming minimalist is the process that gets you to the promise. She said, the name of your book should be The Promise. What is it that becoming minimalist will do for somebody? This is what not only sells books, but this is what is motivating in the process. Because it is hard work. And if all you're thinking is, I just want to own less stuff, then it wears off pretty quickly. So you could just finish this sentence. I desire to own less so that I can what? Spend more time with family, give more money, save more money, travel more, move into a smaller house, downsize finally, whatever it might be. Once you know what that is, tape it to your mirror and use it as motivation. The second thing is you'll need to include your family at some point if you have family. And that looks different for different people. There are three types of relationships when it comes from someone who wants to minimize. There usually is one person who tends to be the driving factor in it. And then on the other side of the relationship, you get one of three responses. Number one, I'm in, let's do it. It's about time. You came to this realization. There's the response of, that sounds pretty good, just don't touch any of my stuff. And then there's the third response. And the third response is the most difficult, and I actually don't have a good answer for it. There are some where the case is like they don't even want you to get rid of any of your own things, and it really is a difficult conversation. But the majority of people are like, yes, let's do it. Even if that's a different things. If I want to get rid of 80%, my wife wanted to get rid of 50%. So it went pretty good for a while, and I wanted to keep going, and she felt pretty good. So if people are on board, then you can do that and find out where that point is. If it's you can get rid of yours, just don't touch mine, then that's where you should be starting anyway. Like you should be starting with your own stuff. And I speak at, I think, every single MOPS group in the entire Phoenix, area. And the first question always is, that was great. How do I get rid of my kids' toys? And my response is always the same. You can't go home and get rid of your kids' stuff first. Like if you're feeling drawn to owning less, and if you're feeling drawn to simplifying or minimizing or decluttering, you can't go home and make your spouse go first or make your kids go first. As a matter of fact, I would go so far as to say you do all of your stuff. You get rid of everything you don't need before you ask them to make any steps along the way. It only seems fair. First of all, it's easier to see everyone else's clutter than it is to see our own. And so what seems like clutter to you, to them, might actually be important, and what seems like clutter to you, to them, might actually be important. So you do your own stuff. You can do your own clothes. You can do, if it's your office, if it's your kitchen, if your garage, you can do a lot of the stuff there. And then when you do talk to your spouse or partner, have a conversation about the life you're living and what you want to do and what you want to be, and present this conversation in words that would resonate with them. So what draws you to owning less might be, I'm just sick and tired of picking up toys every evening. But if your husband or if your wife isn't the one that's picking up the toys every single evening, then that's not going to resonate with them at all. And so what is it that they would get to do more of if they owned less that would make sense? And the light bulb, hey, we could finally start saving some money. You could do more golfing. We could go on those trips. We could, whatever it might be. So think through in that ways. And then patience and grace, always. Patience and grace, humility, faithfulness. An email one time, someone said, hey, I can't get my husband on board with minimalism. Should I divorce him? Yeah. And I wrote back as soon as I could. I'm like, no, that's the exact opposite of what this should do. It should be bringing you closer together. But this takes humility, right? I mean, it takes realizing, hey, I really wish this would change about my husband. But the reality is there's probably things about you that you need to be changing, that you're not budging on either, that you may bring this good thing into your family environment, but your husband or wife might be bringing something different, good, into the family. And so focus on what's good and patience. One time I was talking about leading by example in terms of minimalism, and someone in the front row stood up, raised her hand, and she said, I've been talking to my husband for 5 years about minimalism. And just last week, he came to me and said, hey, this whole thing you're talking about, it finally makes sense to me. And so I think I talk about leading by example, and that ultimately the benefits of minimalism win out. But this doesn't happen in 3 weeks. Sometimes it doesn't happen in 3 months. Sometimes it can take years. In terms of specifically going through your home, a lot of people hear about decluttering, minimizing, owning less, and they think of, I've got to go through my garage. I've got to go through the home office. I need to go through this or that. I really do need to downsize my yarn stash or my book. Or what am I ever going to do with my sentimental things? It's like our minds rush to the hardest area or the hardest thing that we would ever have to get rid of. And you can go spend an hour and a half in the garage and see no progress at the end and just throw up your arms in frustration and say, I'm never, this clearly isn't for me. Good looking guy, but he didn't know what he was talking about in real life. And so a better process I have found is to work through your home, easiest to hardest, starting in the most lived in areas first, and completing a room entirely. So for me, it was my car. I'd pulled my car out of the garage to clean it. I sat in my car to bring it into the garage at the end of the day, and I'm just noticing stuff all the time. There's pens and pencils, and there's coins and receipts and maps and CDs and Happy Meal toys and ketchup packets and like all this stuff in my car that just didn't need to be there. And so it didn't take long, 10, 15 minutes. I just put it all in a bag, kept just what I needed to have in the car, and I set it on the side of the garage. And the next morning, I got in my car to drive to the church, and I thought, man, this feels so much better than it felt before. It's like calming, peaceful. I can focus on my day. And I got home and I thought, where else can I have this same feeling? And so we went to the living room, and for us, it wasn't a huge process, but there were, decorations that were on sale at Hobby Lobby, and there were magazines and DVDs and some toys and like just things that didn't need to be in the living room. And again, it wasn't a huge project for us. It took longer than the car, but I cleared everything out of the living room that didn't need to be there. And I sat down and it's like, this feels so nice in this room. It's like the air is finally able to move from one end to the other. And we just said, what's the next spot that we're going to do? And it was the bedroom, and then the bathrooms, and then the closet. Always moving easiest to hardest, enjoying the benefits of owning less and finding motivation in that to tackle the next space, whatever that might be. So that is the process that I have found to be the most helpful for the most amount of people. As a matter of fact, fingers crossed, in 10 days, we are releasing an app. We've been working on it for like 6 or 7 months, called Clutter Free. And it's the first app of its kind. You will actually enter your home into the app, and it spits out a personalized room by room. Do this room first, do this room second. You enter your rooms, you rank them, and it gives you a personalized, tailored approach to decluttering your home. So pretty excited about it, but I am not supposed to be announcing it because Apple hasn't approved it yet. There you go. Okay, questions. I got about 15, 20 minutes. So what have I not answered about anything? Yes?
Two questions. Two questions. Have you had experiences where you've cut too deep and you've gotten rid of the things that maybe you shouldn't have? And how did you kind of deal with that? I mean, and then just rushing out and repurchasing. I mean, more than that, right? Like, how did you emotionally deal with that? Talking to a spouse, whatever. And then secondly, I think we've all tried to declutter a little bit. I have a nightstand that I, in anger, full disclosure, clean off every 2 or 3 months, right? And then, you go look at it now, it looks like I haven't cleaned it off in years, right? So these things that kind of keep reoccurring in these spots, how do you deal with that?
Okay, so I'll answer the second one first. It was very interesting when I minimized my home and really got it to a lot fewer possessions. I started noticing where things collect in my house. It was very interesting when everything was a little bit cluttery. I wouldn't notice, but once everything was clear, I started thinking, man, every single day something ends up on this corner of the kitchen counter. It's like every single day something ends on my side of the dresser. Like it just becomes, I call them clutter hotspots. It's like, it's where traffic flows. It's on the way to something. And I've learned that, clutter-free habits change from thing to thing and from spot to spot. And so it became where I could say almost and I also learned that clutter seems to attract clutter. And so did I lose the thing on here? Is that why? I learned that clutter seems to attract clutter. And so if my wife's purse was left on this corner of the kitchen counter, then pretty soon the mail was there, and then the homework is there, and then keys were there, and it's like it just collected. So there are different things that I try to do as best I can every single day. I try to clear off my kitchen counter at the end of every day, because if I don't, it just piles up there. There are other places that don't require everyday attention. Once a week, clear this off. Once a month, and you just kind of get used to the rhythms of your life and routine and your home. Concerning the first question, there are very few things that I got rid of that I didn't need. Very, very few. Dave Bruno, who ended up writing a book about the 100 Thing Challenge, his subtitle became the 100 Thing Challenge: Reduce, Reuse, Rejigger. And the third one was very fascinating to me, but what he ended up saying was when he was confined to 100 things, he started realizing that he could solve most problems with those 100 things. That before he thought he needed the egg yolk divider in his kitchen. And he's like, wait, I can do this with a spoon. There are other ways to do things with the things that you have. And so there are times where I got rid of something and okay, what's the new solution to how I don't have that specific tool? Probably the classic ones, we got rid of our folding table, and then we moved here to Arizona, and everyone has Halloween out on their driveway. And so we wanted to host families over on our driveway for Halloween, but we didn't have a folding table. Well, my next door neighbor had a folding table. It was like a phone call, and we continue to borrow that every Halloween. But it's a very interesting line of, and I talk about it, this level of finding enough, like what is the right amount of anything? What is the right amount of shoes that I should have? What is the right amount of pants? Like, what is the right amount of shoes that I should have? There's a Patrick Rohn in a book called Enough. He talks about a tightrope walker, how the tightrope walker finds balance by leaning between one and the other and adjusting themselves. And he'll say, when it comes to our possessions, we don't think we have enough. Meanwhile, it's because we've spent our entire life off balance. We've spent our entire life with too much stuff. And so we think this is normal, but we're actually really off balance. And the only way we can find what is the right amount of stuff is to even teeter over a little bit too less for a little while. And so as a part of the Uncluttered Court, I have a 3-week challenge where I ask people to wear just 33 articles of clothing for 3 months. 3 weeks, just 3 weeks. And I say, hey, you might find out that it's not enough. Like, maybe you do need an extra pair of shoes. But at that point, then you can say, okay, the right amount is actually 40 or 45. So we had 2 cars, and I hated having 2 cars, and we sold one, and I found out that it didn't work, so we had to replace our car. So is that big enough? Yeah. Had to replace a car. It was just, I found that having 1 car was more of a burden than having 2. But I never would have known that until I had tried it out a little bit. So the goal is that our possessions should never be a burden in too much or too little, right? Like, the goal is what is just the optimal amount of things. But sometimes we can't discover that until we really try to push our boundaries and experiment a little bit. Okay, yeah.
That's okay. So trying to do my thinking in terms of like the whole carbon footprint thing, knowing what to throw away, what to give away. Can you give us kind of like a rule of thumb as to what kind of things we should throw away and what kind of things we should give away?
I don't have a good rule, but I have a couple helpful thoughts for you. Number one, let's start with selling or donating. Number one, if you don't need the money, then just donate your things. Because trying to sell everything adds energy and burden and effort and usually frustration that we're not getting as much as we thought. Pardon me. If you really need the money, then that's different. If you have really expensive items or really large things that you can't haul away, other than, it sounds like the kids will come and get them, then I think you donate. Generosity is the byproduct of minimalism. But it's also the very lifeblood of it. I have discovered we had a lot of kids things. My daughter was 3 by the time we finished this process, and we weren't going to have any more children. And so all of her baby things and my wife's maternity things and newborn stuff was in our basement. Tried to sell it. Most people didn't buy it. We made enough at the garage sale to like go out for pizza, and we were all too exhausted to cook anyway. So that was our garage sale experience. But I called my friend Lori. She worked at the Burlington Center CareNet Pregnancy Center, and I'm like, hey, we got all these kids things, and could you use them down there at the pregnancy center? And she's like, Joshua, that's literally what we do. I'm like, we help single mothers and families in poverty who are having children, and we provide them with maternity clothes. And some of them are really debating, clothes or food. And if you have things, then this is what we do. We help out families in need. I'm like, I don't know why I never considered that need in my community. all this stuff was just sitting in my basement when there was someone legitimately in my town praying for the thing that was in my basement. And so I went downstairs and I found even more things. I'm like, I don't need this stuff anymore. There's someone who does. The refugee resettlement program in Vermont took a lot of our housewares. And when you start seeing the need that your excess can meet, it becomes motivating to get rid of even more. When it comes to recycling versus throwing away, it trips up a lot of people. I think you should do your best to try to donate. I think you should do your best to recycle. But there are some things that can't be donated and they can't be recycled. And in that case, I don't think that you don't solve any problems by holding on to that thing going forward. It is the resources have been pulled out of the earth. It is a thing. And if it has outlived its life and it's going to end up in a landfill, then it's either going to end up in a landfill today or it's going to end up in a landfill when you die and someone else is going to have to do it. Making your house like, I'm going to store this. Exactly. And it's tough for people, and you can't change the past. Like, you can't go back and say, I wish I hadn't bought all this stuff. You can only learn from it. And you can, I forget who said it first, but they said, we redeem the past when we learn from it. The past becomes our servant when we become a better person going forward. You can't change it, but if you can take the events and become a new person going forward, then it actually begins to serve you, even if it was a mistake in that way. Unless it still has the tags on it, you can take it back.
Hello, thanks for coming out. So my question is, I have a lot of trouble with, looking at some of the things that I own and say, I could use that one day, so I need to keep it just in case, So for instance, winter gear and things like that, living in Arizona, I use them once, twice a year, something like that. So how do you practically, get rid of some of the things that you may need one day? I guess that's my biggest struggle. Yeah.
So a couple thoughts, and no easy answers for this one. I think it comes down to asking yourself a couple questions. How likely am I to use this? If you go and spend time in winter once a year, then you don't want to buy a new winter coat. I go skiing once a year with friends, and so I have a ski coat and ski pants, and I'm not going to buy a new one every single year. But if I haven't been skiing in 4 years and I don't have any plans to, do I need to hold on to it? So what is the likelihood that you're actually going to use it? Could something else meet that need if it's a tool that I might need to use? Or how hard is something like this to borrow from somebody else? Like our folding table example, we use it once a year and we just borrow it every single year, even though I know I would use it once a year. I don't have to. So the questions are, how likely am I to use it? How much would it cost to replace if I did need it? How easy would it be to get it? There's another fascinating conversation. Francine J., she writes this whole idea about decluttering your fantasy self, which is another related conversation where we have like this picture in our mind of a person that we are or a person that we want to be. And so we've collected all this stuff to be this person, but we don't actually ever end up using it. And we like the idea of using it, but we don't ever actually use it. And so a guy came up to me in Orlando one time, and he said, when you were talking, I started thinking of I have shelves and shelves of books in my office, and I haven't read hardly any of them. I have all these unread books, and it occurs to me that I have always wanted to be a reader. He said, but I'm in my 40s and I'm starting to realize that I'm just not a reader. I learn different ways. It's not that I don't learn. It's not that I don't grow. It's just I've been told forever and ever that you have to be a reader to be a smart person, and I'm finally coming to the realization that that's not me. And sometimes it looks like different hobbies we wish we did, hobbies that we used to do, that we think we're going to get back into, but it's been years and we really don't. And the genius part about it really is that when we start getting rid of our fantasy self clutter, it allows us to walk more fully in the person that we actually are. And now I don't feel regret that I haven't read all those books, because I'm listening to my audiobooks, and this is how I learn. And I'm able to embrace that, as opposed to constantly wishing or thinking or fantasizing about being something that I'm not. So that's a long answer to that question. Any others?
Piggyback on the environment kind of issue that you alluded to, and this lady here. I do this personally, just to share with others, to reduce plastics and all. And also, it's good for your health. They're finding like these plastic fries, any kind of plastic drinking bottles. The plastics can wear out into the liquid. You can see fragments of plastic. So it's your personal benefit to abstain or try to drink it out of a plastic bottle, especially those small ones like that. So what I do is I found it on the internet. So try to get these little portable glass jars, a little small portable one, especially here in Arizona. You can't leave your plastic bottles in your car for more than an hour, because the plastic will leach out. So that's another thing. The downside is you're going to have to find one. This is a lemonade jar that a wife bought. And I said, yeah, that's a great idea. I'll try. So also, you can reduce usage of the plastic by go to Costco or anywhere, your favorite box top store, and get those gallon ones. But I found the Costco plastic gallon containers are a little bit thicker than other ones. You can take those and use the filling station at a grocery store or whatever they got it. It's like 25 cents to 31 cents in the range. And above all, I tested the water with a purifier. Parts per million of particulates in the water is less than the ones in those plastic bottles. They're like 10 or 11. On the low end is the better, close to zero. But the bigger size or the smaller ones is like in the 38 to 40. So
I found it was very interesting. Let me close with two thoughts related to that, and then related to something else. I started owning fewer possessions. So started in May. Took us again about 3 or 4 months to get through our lived-in areas, and then 9 months if you want to count basements and garages. And then we moved in a smaller house 3 or 4 years later and got rid of even more stuff. So kind of felt like going through these layers. But we started in May. My birthday's in December. And my wife asked me what I wanted for my birthday. And it had been, 6 or 7 months of getting rid of stuff. And I'm like, I have no idea what I want. Certainly not another tie. I just got rid of 12. And a Planet Fitness had opened up about a mile from our house, and they had their $10 a month deal. And I'm like, man, I seem to have a little extra time now. I'm not taking care of things. I'm not out shopping, and a gym membership wouldn't be clutter. I said, how about you give me a gym membership? I never had a gym membership before. And so she bought it for me, and I started going to the gym. And then after about 4 or 5 weeks of going to the gym, I started wondering why I was coming home and having potato chips and soda after working out at the gym. And so I started changing the way I was eating. I changed my diet. I started to take a look at my calendar and my schedule with this same filter of, Like, how am I spending my time that helps me accomplish what God wants me to accomplish? And what am I just filling my time with that's distracting me from it? Even if it's just useless television or commitments that I don't need to be a part of. And I found that intentionality in possessions brought about intentionality in all sorts of other areas. The habits that I was embracing, the way I was spending my time, the way I was looking at the world and how I was interacting with the things around me. Like, intentionality brings about intentionality. It brings about intentionality. And for me, it started with material possessions. I pastored for 15 years. I loved it. I never wanted to do anything more than pastoring. But God made it clear over about 3.5 years that he was calling me into this new ministry is the only way I can say it. And I don't always get to talk about God. I don't always get to talk about Christ when I speak, but I always think to myself, if I can at least dislodge people from pursuing life and happiness in material possessions, I don't know where they're going to look next for life and fulfillment and happiness. Maybe it's traveling. Maybe it's laying on a beach. I don't know what it's going to be, but if I can at least dislodge this pursuit, eventually some people are going to run into Christ as they're beginning to question, then what is my life going to be lived for? But probably one of the most significant moments is the parable of the sower in the book of Luke. If you know the parable of the sower, there's 4 soils. It falls on the path, and the seed doesn't grow at all. The seed falls on the shallow soil, and it doesn't grow any roots, and it dries up in the sun. There's a third seed that falls on soil, and it grows roots, and it grows, but the weeds and the thorns choke out all the fruit. And then there's a fourth soil that the seed grows roots and it bears fruit 30, 60, 100-fold. And I was reading the parable, and I was sharing it with a friend of mine, and I said, it's one of the rare parables where Jesus actually explains what he meant by it. And he says, look, some people hear the word of God and want nothing to do with it. There's a second group of people, and they hear the word of God, and they're excited, but they don't ever grow in their faith, and so the world and temptation carries them away. There's a third group that accepts the word and grows in faith, but the weeds choke out the fruitfulness. It knows Christ, it's growing, but it is not a fruitful follower of Christ. And Jesus explains what it is that chokes out the fruitfulness of the seed. You can look it up in the book of Luke. It is worries, riches, and pleasures is what chokes out the fruitfulness of the seed. I remember sharing it to my friend, and I said, did you know that it says pleasures, riches, and worries? Like everything the American dream is built on? Like that this is what's choking out the fruitfulness of the seed? And he goes, oh, I'm sure it's the love of riches. And I said, yeah, actually that does make more sense. So I'm really questioning myself, and I looked it up, and it doesn't say the love of riches. It's pleasures, riches, worries are choking out the fruitfulness of the seed. I have read that parable for years, and I have spent my entire life thanking God that I was the fourth soil. I've spent my whole life thinking, I'm so thankful that I'm among the 30, 60, or 100-fold. But I got to tell you, at least as a whole, the American church, we're the third seed. Like, we have faith, we know Christ, we have roots, but all the things of the world are choking out our fruitfulness, whether as individuals or as a corporate church going forward. And so when I get invited to speak at a church, if it's a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning, I'm like, I'm in. Like, this is my ministry, this is my heart and this is my passion, that we would begin removing excess possessions so that we can become as fruitful as we can be, not just for ourselves, but for the kingdom of God going forward. Thank you so much for having me today.